X-Men and Alpha Flight number 1 is called The Gift, and it's the first part of what would eventually become known in the X-Men mythos as the Asgardian Wars. In this issue, Madelyne and Cyclops are flying a bunch of scientists to do an environmental study in cold, wintry Canada when the plane is suddenly shot down. The X-Men and Alpha Flight team up to investigate, and they discover that everyone is fine, and in fact better than fine, as they've all been transformed into the ultimate expression of themselves and gifted superhuman abilities that complement their own natural gifts. Everything seems too good to be true, and of course it is, as strange things start to happen, like Snowbird falling mysteriously ill and Shaman's medicine bag going berserk. This issue doesn't delve into what or why anything is happening yet, but it does give us a bit of a hint as to who's behind it all, as we see Loki beseeching those who sit above in shadow, asking for a favor and promising that if he gets it, he'll make sure that there's everlasting peace on Earth. And coming from a trickster god, there's gotta be some strings attached to that promise. I really liked this issue, and I thought it did a good job of setting the scene for this two-part miniseries. There were times when it felt a bit dialogue heavy with stuff that I didn't really care about, or that felt like it was just superfluous information, like Cyclops bonding with all the scientists in the beginning. I think it was good to set the tone for who these characters were, but it definitely felt like a slow start to the issue. We get some fun action when Rachel attacks Alpha Flight and the two teams have a bit of a skirmish, but aside from that and a brief danger room sequence, there isn't really much happening in terms of fisticuffs in this issue. This issue is mostly just meant to play on the inter-team dynamics between the X-Men and Alpha Flight, which is fun because the last time they interacted with each other, it was kind of as enemies. And so them finding this moment of uneasy peace with each other gives the dialogue-heavy scenes that follow enough tension to keep it interesting. Pacing-wise, though, yeah, sometimes it's a bit of a slog to read through, if only because there is so much talking and explaining of things. But I think this miniseries is mostly meant to be about a philosophical idea anyway, so being aware of that, I don't totally mind the excess walking and talking of this issue in place of the usual fight scenes that we're accustomed to. As long as the character work is on point, I can pretty much swallow anything, and everyone here has a very distinct voice, so I'm swallowing it whole. It's a fun, if somewhat heavy, first issue of this miniseries, and even though it ended on a sort of anticlimactic cliffhanger, if you ask me, just with Shaman being attacked, I still really enjoyed it overall. Here are my highlights from X-Men and Alpha Flight number 1.
Rachel.
This issue is super important in the character development of Rachel Summers because it's the first time she comes face to face with her father from another timeline, Cyclops. In her timeline, Cyclops is dead, so she never really had a relationship with him, and up until now, the only interaction she had with him was when she prank called him on the phone back in Uncanny X-Men number 185. Rachel sort of kicks off this series of events that transpire in this issue when she has a sci flash of Maddie's plane crashing and sees Cyclops doused in flames. The team travels to Canada to see if Alpha Flight had anything to do with it, and she's boiling with such rage that she decides to strike first and ask questions later. She ambushes Shaman and almost gets Heather sucked into his medicine pouch before Professor X and Nightcrawler manage to intervene and stop her. Xavier scolds her for acting so recklessly, and she feels kind of bad after she learns that Alpha Flight actually had nothing to do with the attack on the plane whatsoever. I loved watching impetuous Rachel take on all of Alpha Flight. Up until now, we hadn't really seen a ton of Rachel in action. We only heard from people like Celine and Tessa about how powerful she is and the potential that she possesses, so it was really fulfilling watching her take down a good chunk of this team almost single-handedly. Later, when the two teams come face to face with Cyclops at the Golden Palace, Rachel formally meets him for the first time, and she's pretty tongue-tied. This is not surprising behavior at all, since that's how she got when she called him on the phone too, and even though it feels like Cyclops has a suspicion about her here that he can't quite place, Rachel begs her friends to play it cool and keep her lineage a secret from him, at least for the time being. Even though Kitty seems pretty eager for Rachel to spill the beans, Xavier abides by her wishes and simply introduces her as a new student. I give props to Rachel for knowing that now is probably not the right time to throw that bomb on Cyclops. They're in the middle of a mission, and the last thing they need is a giant distraction interrupting them like, "Hey, I'm your daughter from another timeline." Plus, this way, Rachel gets to know her father more on like a different level, something that's more like team-based before it becomes something that's family-based. Everyone behaves differently in specific social settings, and Rachel just wants to get to know the real Cyclops before she gets to know the father figure Cyclops. One of the best parts of this issue comes toward the end when Professor X announces that Madelyne is pregnant and she says that it's a boy. Rachel is totally flabbergasted and she throws a bit of a fit because in her timeline, Rachel is not only the firstborn child, but she is the only born child. So to her, this announcement makes it seem as though Rachel will never actually exist within this timeline. That's a pretty world-shattering thing to discover, that you're in a time and place where you never actually will be, if you know what I mean. She was already feeling insecure enough just being around her future father, but now to find out that this guy won't actually be her father, and that she won't actually exist is just too much for her to handle, and she runs out of there. Sykes probably there thinking, "Geez, Professor, you just letting anybody in these days?" He has no idea why Rachel freaked out the way she did, and it's quite the first impression for her to be making. I really dug Rachel in this issue overall, and I'm super happy that we're finally getting to see these awkward Summers family dynamics play out.
Madelyne Pryor.
Madelyne Pryor has what I think is one of her only bouts of super-powered heroism in this miniseries. There's a super-powered version of Madelyne on the team that Havoc joins when he's transported to the Mutant X timeline that took place for a while in the 90s. And of course, there's the super-powered Goblin Queen Madelyne that we all know and love. But this version of Madelyne was the only time that she was like a pure, uncorrupted individual who gained a measure of superpowers and benevolently used them for good instead of for evil. In this issue, she changes her name to Anodyne, and she gains the power of healing flames that are able to heal people from whatever ails them. She heals Puck of the curse that was put on him by the Black Razor so that he can regain his original height. Then she heals the minds of both Sasquatch and Aurora, first purging the bestial rage from Sasquatch's mind, and then consolidating the competing personalities within Aurora to make her whole. And then lastly, she heals Rogue of her inability to control her mutant power, so that now she's finally able to touch people and not worry about draining their life forces. Up until now, Madelyne had only ever been seen as like a Jean Grey lookalike, albeit the totally human version of Jean Grey, who married Cyclops and was living the happily ever after that he and Jean were meant to have lived. In this issue, though, she finally gets to join in on all the mutant fun, and we see what it's like for Madelyne to have some powers of her own and put them to use. It's a great thing to do to be able to help your friends, especially for someone like Madelyne, who, as a human, is usually relegated to the sidelines. The fact that her powers manifest themselves as flames is kind of interesting, and I wonder if that's on purpose to reference the Phoenix Force, which of course is something tied to Jean, or if it's a bit of heavy foreshadowing for her eventual corruption when the flames of Inferno come licking at her heels and she becomes the Goblin Queen. It's probably neither of these references, and I'm thinking too much of it, but subconsciously, the writer might have been planting things before he even knew it. I enjoyed seeing Madelyne as Anodyne in this issue because it was nice seeing her in an active role that isn't complaining to Scott about how much time he's spending being a superhero, and instead she gets to enjoy the spotlight herself. There's another side to be said of this argument, though, where this version of Madelyne actually detracts from her character due to the powers that she's suddenly imbued with. Madelyne was always inexorably human in the comics until she wasn't, and being human was kind of her appeal. She was not the Omega-powered celestial guardian that Jean ended up becoming with the Phoenix, and she did have like similar human flaws and characteristics that Jean possessed, but Madelyne was able to embody them more because that's all she was. Maddie being completely human felt like it was a way for the editors to pivot her from being just a carbon copy of Jean into being a character with an actual identity and a self-image of her own, and in fact one that Jean could never have had, her having been a mutant, whereas Madelyne is a human. It actually helped set them apart and distinguish them more, and Madelyne not having any abilities actually is her competitive advantage over Jean because it gives Madelyne the opportunity to explore the normal life that Jean could never explore. Madelyne is the bizarro version of Jean Grey in almost every way, and so here in this issue, where she does gain abilities and thus inches closer to being more like the actual Jean Grey, it kind of diminishes her identity and the path that she's carved out for herself as a totally human ally for the main X-Men team. But that's just a critical analysis of the situation, and as a comic book fanboy, I overall really did enjoy seeing Madelyne with these fun new powers, and seeing her in a leadership role here as opposed to just being reactive on the sidelines.
Rogue and Northstar.
Rogue and Northstar form an interesting sort of bond in this issue, though it's not really at the behest of Northstar, and he's kind of forced into it due to the nature of Rogue's powers and how she forces herself on him. During the initial skirmish between the X-Men and Alpha Flight, when Rachel attacks Shaman thinking that he was the one who downed Madelyne's plane, Rogue goes to stop her, but Northstar grabs Rogue and whisks her away before she can intervene. Rogue then does what Rogue does best, and that's give him a non-consensual kiss so that she zaps his strength and, as a byproduct, absorbs part of his psyche as well. For a split instant, she learns all of his deepest, darkest secrets, and though she doesn't share any of them with the rest of the class, her attitude toward Northstar softens as a result of whatever it was that she learned, and she seeks to bond with him in a very empathetic way. Rogue is a highly sensitive character, and so when she learns of what Northstar is going through, which is presumably his closeted homosexuality at this time, she doesn't balk or shun him, and instead she tries to get him to talk about it and offers herself as like a sounding board for him. Northstar wasn't officially out during this era of Alpha Flight, though I believe the plan with his character was that he was always supposed to be the gay character. I think I read somewhere that the Comic Code Authority didn't allow for the outright portrayal of gay characters back then, and so Marvel had to tread kind of lightly and be like super metaphorical and symbolic with how they presented LGBTQ characters. Northstar was given the personality of a woman-hating little bitch, which was a bit on the nose in a way, but his snobbery is also one of his most endearing traits as a character, at least in my opinion. It's probably my favorite thing about him. He has definitely softened over the years, especially in recent days while he led X Factor, and I think the contrast of how he was back then versus how he is now is meant to demonstrate like how he's in a much better place now. Like he's in a healthy relationship with both himself and his husband, so he can feel secure and he doesn't have to be such a negative attitude all the time. But back during this time with Alpha Flight, when he was still trying to reconcile his own identity, he was definitely super guarded and super defensive, and I think his struggle with accepting himself and worrying over others accepting him as well is probably why he had such a short fuse all the time and was literally just a prick. Northstar didn't officially come out until a little while after this miniseries, but definitely the seeds were sown early on in his character, and in this issue specifically, Rogue kind of becomes the first person to learn of his sexuality, and I think the way that she reacted really helped build his confidence toward accepting himself and also feeling like others will accept him too. She didn't shun him, and she also didn't out him to others. She respected his privacy, and I think because of that, he ends up respecting her. Rogue and Northstar don't really have much of a relationship in future issues, but I think because of this intimacy that they shared here, there will always be a sort of special bond between them now, even if most writers probably forgot this moment ever happened between them.
Heather Hudson.
Ugh, boring ol' Heather Hudson. Something about Heather always reminds me of like a bookworm from school kind of trope character. I think it's the way they depict her as being so mousy. I just struggle to really find her interesting at all. Heather is the leader of the Alpha Flight team in this issue, and she struggles with that role because she doesn't see herself as a leader due to the fact that she's merely human and everybody else is superpowered. She's not yet sporting the Vindicator costume in these issues, and so all that she's got are her smarts and her wits, and she feels like neither of those two things gives her the proper authority to lead a bunch of superpowered beings. And maybe she's not wrong. Unlike Madelyne, who I think is almost most interesting when she's human versus when she's superpowered, it does take superpowers for me to find Heather Hudson interesting in the slightest, which is not a good sign for Heather's character as a whole. Wolverine tries to assuage her fears and let her know that she's a leader with or without powers, and by now Wolverine has been depicted as kind of being like an old wise man trope, so any tidbits of advice that he dishes out should almost always be taken as fact. But it doesn't quell Heather's fears, and she accepts the magic fountain's gift of transformation, and by the end of the issue, she becomes Guardian, and she finally feels like she has the proper capabilities to lead Alpha Flight. Even though Heather isn't a particularly favorite character of mine, I do enjoy this struggle of finding her voice as a leader. I think it's a good storyline for a human character, and I like how in the end she totally gives into temptation and relinquishes her humanity for the sake of becoming the best possible leader she can be. Do I think it's the right message to send in terms of aspirational values? No, probably not. But I think in her headspace, it's exactly what her character would do. Dive in headfirst to meet her responsibilities before they swallow her whole. It's probably what anybody would do. And so even though she doesn't know the cost of what she's doing, she's willing to sacrifice herself not only for the sake of her team, but also for the sake of herself. It's kind of like a magic cosmetic surgery. She had the innate leadership abilities within her the entire time, and this magic fountain is just good at helping her express them and bringing them out to the forefront. Of course, there's going to be a catch to all of this, but for now, I like Heather kind of being under the spell of whatever magic is going on, and even though she thinks she's in control, we all know she's not, right? What will be interesting to watch is her finally achieving these leadership qualities that she so desired, and then watching them inevitably be taken away from her, probably in the next issue. Will she crumble without them, or will she realize that she had them inside of her all along? I don't know, but either way, I think this experience will enrich Heather's character at least a little bit more. And girl needs all the help she can get.
Sasquatch and Aurora.
Sasquatch and Aurora have an on-off relationship in Alpha Flight, except in this case, it's only ever on when the flirty and feisty side of Aurora's personality is on, and then it's off again when the shy, docile side takes over and Aurora can't stand the sight of him. And much like the reserved side of Aurora, Sasquatch doesn't really do it for me either. Turning into a giant Sasquatch as a power is pretty boring. It's like the Hulk or Ursa Major from the Winter Guard. Changing forms to turn into an animalistic powerhouse doesn't really have a lot of interesting nuances to it, in my opinion. In the Hulk's case, he becomes more dim-witted when he's in Hulk mode, and that contrast is really all you can do with this type of power to make it interesting. Sasquatch has a similar ailment in that his beast mode has been taking over every time he turns into Sasquatch, but I mean, other than that, there's not really much else about this character to write home about. I think what helps with making his character a bit more interesting is partnering him up with someone like Aurora, who is so much more dynamic. Much like her brother Northstar, Aurora has a feisty personality that just seems to go part and parcel with the Beaubier line. Aurora's dissociative identity disorder is one of the more interesting aspects about her character, if only because the two competing sides of herself are so distinct and they hate each other so much. Mental distress is nothing new to most characters in the Marvel Universe, but with characters like Aurora and Typhoid Mary and Legion, where the different personalities create such interesting developments for the character, it's hard as a fan to not want to cling to the constant mental state of these characters for their captivating story points. What I liked about Aurora and Sasquatch in this issue was that we did get to see a brief glimpse of what life would be like for them with their personalities totally reconciled. Anodyne heals them with her flame, and for a moment they are so jovial and happy with each other that my cynical little heart can't help but skip a beat for them. At the end of the day, I do wish for happiness for all these characters, even though trial by fire and conflict and drama is what I need from them before I can let them get there. I'm sure I'd get pretty bored pretty fast by this new power couple of Sasquatch and Aurora, as without their issues, there's really nothing too great about either character. But for now, it's nice to see them share a brief respite of happiness with each other.
Snowbird.
Snowbird is and always has been my favorite character from Alpha Flight. Something about the way she looks with that costume just always gravitated me toward her. She's the true Queen of the North, and I think probably one of the most popular of the Alpha Flight characters overall, even though it feels like she's always dead or on the brink of death, much like she is in this issue. Snowbird is in bad shape from some sort of mysterious malady, and she beseeches Shaman's help because some sort of evil magic is perverting the realm, and since she is a being of magic, it is affecting her harshest of all. It really sucked seeing Snowbird like this, her being my favorite character and all. She was incapacitized for pretty much the entire issue, and we didn't really get to see any action from her at all. Story-wise, it was great because she is like a demigoddess, and so anything that can hurt her in this way has gotta be a supremely bad threat. But just as a fan of hers in general, I was hoping I'd get to see more Snowbird doing something fun. Instead, her health just got worse and worse all issue long, to the point where she disappeared from the entire group by the end, and Wolverine and some of the scientists had to go out and search for her. It's pretty clear that something fishy is going on with this magic golden palace that has just appeared out of nowhere, and if a goddess like Narya can't even be seen in a place like it, then people like Heather Hudson better be careful about what gifts they are accepting from it.
Professor X.
There's a recurring theme in modern day comics about how much of a jerk Professor X really is. It's not necessarily something that is always published in the books, but it's definitely a trope that's discussed ad nauseum with the fandom. I can't deny that he's done some shady stuff, but I think his lack of perfection is what makes him interesting, because he's really not that interesting of a character without it. If there wasn't a dark side or a questionable moral imperative associated with Charles, he'd just be like a creepy bald teacher who wears way too much corduroy, and nobody needs any of that. I don't hate Xavier as much as other people seem to, but I don't really find him interesting at all either, except for when he is doing some shady shit. In this issue, he joins up with the X Squad as they hit up Canada to confront Alpha Flight about what happened to Madelyne's plane. He stops Rachel during her initial fracas with Shaman and takes her to the astral plane for quite the scolding. Then he leads the team with the Alphans as they travel to the Golden Palace to investigate what's up. With Storm's absence, he's leading the team in this issue, and I've got to say, he's doing a pretty fine job of it. He's keeping everyone in check and is respecting everyone's privacy, so I mean, as far as Xavier's track record is concerned, this issue stacks up to be one of his better days. That is, until he probes Madelyne's mind to see if she's being controlled by some sort of evil presence. Like a good leader, he doesn't outright trust all of these strange happenings, and so he questions things before he accepts them. Unlike other leaders who just dive headfirst into fire fountains before investigating them in order to gain superpowers, like Heather Hudson, Xavier is proceeding with caution, and he wants to make sure everything is kosher before he gives his seal of approval. So he scans Cyclops and Maddie's minds for evil influence, but instead he discovers that Madelyne is pregnant, and he decides to share that news with the entire group immediately instead of letting Madelyne do it herself in her own time. I mean, come on, Professor. That is not okay. You can't just announce that someone is pregnant before they want to announce it first. Obviously, he meant no ill will by it, but it's another indication of the Professor having somewhat odder social cues and standards than the others. It's a totally disrespectful moment, which luckily Madelyne didn't seem to care too much about, but still, I'd be like, yo, Charles, mind your damn business. At the very least, it stopped Madelyne from throwing a gender reveal party, and maybe he saw those were her intentions within her mind, so in the end, he just did everybody a favor by spoiling the surprise himself.
Shaman.
Shaman really gets a tough break in this issue. Not as tough as Snowbird, but it still isn't good. First, he's attacked by Rachel, then his medicine pouch starts sucking Heather inside of it, and later the pouch goes crazy and starts attacking him himself, supposedly mortally wounding him to the point where not even Anodyne's healing flames can heal him. He's probably one of the main Alpha Flight characters in this issue, and his role as the team's doctor is really what is showcased the most here. He was giving his team a bunch of checkups before the X-Men burst in on them and ruined things, but by the end of the issue, he's the one who needs help, and apparently no one can help him. I felt this ending was a little bit rushed. It's like there was so much chit-chatter within the palace about this and about that, so by the time the medicine pouch needed to act up and imperil Shaman, there were like no panels left to really give it that oomph moment, and so this entire final act had to happen in like a page. Anodyne suddenly announcing that Shaman is dying for some reason doesn't really give me the gravitas that the cliffhanger needs, and I think it's because the whole fight with demons from the medicine pouch was over in like an instant. Like, we saw them come out and attack him, but then a panel later, Northstar and Aurora have grabbed it and thrown it far, far away, so that couldn't have been that tough. We didn't really get enraptured by the fight between him and the demons, and we didn't really see what they did to him, so having Anodyne tell us that he's dying as opposed to having let us, the readers, see him get mortally injured really does this ending a disservice.
The Scientists.
As much as I love an unsung character, or even a cameo appearance by people we may never see again, this is a lot of human characters to introduce to us at one time. There are like 7 of them or something, and I think why this issue felt a bit slow in the pacing at the beginning was because we had to give so much time to establish who each of them were and detail what their specialties were. I understand it was necessary in order to comprehend the plot point of them all becoming gifted by the Golden Palace, but it was still a bit of a drag to sort through. After the humans are transformed, they become the ultimate expressions of their human potential, so a character like Miss Ballinger, who was a cook, becomes cornucopia, and she can prepare delicious feasts and stuff. We don't really see a lot of the other scientists in action in this issue, so I'm confused as to why so much time was spent establishing them in the beginning, and I'm hoping that we'll get to see what all of them can do in the next issue. Otherwise, it just feels like a waste of time learning anything about them.
Loki.
Loki only has a tiny appearance in this issue, and it's when he's asking those who sit above in shadow for the favor. Those in shadow are like Asgardian gods to the Asgardian gods, more or less, and to win their favor is to gain considerable might and power, and so Loki wants to exploit that. These shadowy gods aren't fools, however, and they know of Loki's nature, so they tell him he must prove himself worthy of their favor by going against his natural inclination of mischievousness and do some sort of altruistic good deed for the people of Earth. Loki is not one to not be self-serving, though, and even though he agrees to the terms and claims that he'll bring everlasting peace to Earth, it's still in the service of him getting something out of it, so we'll see how all of this ties back in the next issue. At this point, it can be assumed that the Golden Palace and the new powers that the scientists all got were gifts from Loki, as the title of the issue is also probably hinting at, but Loki hasn't been seen interacting with either the X-Men or Alpha Flight yet, so I'm sure a big ol' battle is bound to come next issue, and I heartily look forward to it.
Panels.
Here are some panels that I found cute or cool or clever from this issue. Number 5. Professor X scolding Rachel on the astral plane. If Rachel didn't have an inferiority complex already, leave it to Charles to remind her just how small she is in the land of the psychics. Number 4. Heather getting sucked into Shaman's medicine pouch. Literally all the other Alphans are fighting off a superpowered X-Man, and what's Heather fighting off? A cloth bag. Number 3, the long, luscious legs of the lady who sits above in shadow. I know standing isn't really her thing, but with a pair of stems like hers, it's a damn shame these shadow gods are regulated to sitting. Number 2, Rachel smashing her plate of food in shock. Sure, she just found out that she'll never exist in this timeline, but is that any reason to let a perfectly good turkey leg go to waste? I don't think so. Number 1. My favorite panel in this issue is Shaman being attacked by the horde of demons. This panel happens pretty out of the blue at the end of the story, and judging by the look on Shaman's face, it caught him off guard as well. There's a lot of exciting demonic energy in this panel, and the onslaught of monsters here really gives us some terrifying insight into the sheer vastness within Shaman's medicine bag of plenty. I don't have a favorite noise lettering in this issue because there wasn't any noise lettering in this issue, but just for good measure, I'll call out Xavier scolding Rachel again because it's the closest thing we have to an actual sound effect, and she had it coming. Rachel!
Fashion.
The clear winners by far of the fashion scene in this issue are the transformed scientists. Every one of them is decked out to the nines in their new fantasy couture, and they look like they are ready to crash the local Dungeons & Dragons weekend tournament. Something about these garments kind of reminds me of the graduation costumes that the New Mutants would eventually wear. Not really because they necessarily have the same look, but they have like similar color palettes or something like that. Like this guy kind of looks like Karma, and this one's kind of looks like Magma. I'm sure there's no direct correlation between either of these two sets, but surely you can see what I'm getting at here.
Ads.
There were no ads in this special edition X-Men and Alpha Flight issue, which surprised me because I don't know when that ever really happens with for-profit comic book companies like Marvel. Aren't ad sales a big part of revenue? I want to say it was nice reading the story cover to cover without a page of ads to interrupt it, but in reality, I don't even think I noticed until I actually flipped through this magazine to find an ad to highlight and came up short. I think by now I'm just so desensitized to ad pages that seeing them or not seeing them all registers on the same level of selective attention for me. Marvel did manage to inject an ad for one of its other ad-free comic books though. It's of the one-shot Heroes for Hope X-Men special where all the proceeds were donated to famine relief and recovery in Africa. This is actually a really cool issue, and I'll probably do a review of it whenever I get there chronologically because the art and the story are a lot more captivating than the usual pro-social message PSA style charity books are. And that's it for this issue. I really enjoyed it, and even though I think adjusting the pacing just a bit might have improved it, the overall issue was still really fun with enough action to keep me entertained and really, really great character work to keep me invested. I'll be reviewing part 2 of this mini-series next, and then I'll get back into the regular Uncanny X-Men chronology. If you liked this review, please feel free to browse my channel for more videos like it. I also create other videos like rankings and ruminations, so there's definitely something for everyone. I want to thank you for stopping by and sharing your time with me today, and be sure to come back again soon for more Great X-Mentations.